Hello, my name is James Trost, and this is A2 Insight. Today's guest is Dr. Earl Lewis of the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan. Dr. Lewis, welcome to A2 Insight.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Great. Well, we're very glad to have you here. I'd like to start out by having our folks at home get to know a little bit more about you, where you grew up, early influences, and let you get through your undergraduate years in college. And I know that's a lot to cover, but why don't we just begin with that as your starting off point?
So I'm a native of Norfolk, Virginia, the Tidewater area. I was born in Norfolk, went to school in what is now the city of Chesapeake. And I typically say I was part of that transitional generation. I was born in 1955, went to segregated schools until I was in the 10th grade. Was part of the large push of students who desegregated schools in Virginia and across the South in the early 70s. And so I end up saying that I had two educations. One that talked about what it meant to be in the majority, because in an all-black world, there was no such thing as minority. And then to be part of that generation, that transition, where all of a sudden words like minority came to shape one's understanding of where you were in society. Left Virginia, though, in 1974 and went all the way out to western Minnesota. And I've spent the last 4.5 decades trying to explain how a kid from Norfolk, Virginia ends up in Moorhead, Minnesota.
Well, can you start here? If you've had, I'd be very interested in knowing as well.
So it was 1973-74 academic year. I was a senior, and I started looking at schools, and most of my classmates who were in the courses I was taking either applied to the University of Virginia or Virginia Tech. And the assumption was that I would too. I thought, yeah, that's an option. The other assumption was that there were a number of historically black colleges and universities. My mother was a product of one. So some folks assumed I would either go to Hampton or some other institution along the Eastern Seaboard. I had decided I'd already experienced desegregating schools in the South, and I wasn't sure I wanted to do that in college in the same way as I'd done it in high school. So UVA was not on the list, Virginia Tech, Chapel Hill. And then out of the blue, I get this brochure from this little school, church-affiliated school in western Minnesota, Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. And for reasons that seem now somewhat inexplicable, there was something about the brochure and its description of itself that appealed. Had never been to Minnesota, applied, was accepted, would only go to Moorhead and to Concordia the summer just before I moved there to go to undergraduate studies. And I still remember the longest bus ride in my life, going from Norfolk all the way to Moorhead, and traveled with my mother, my brother, and my grandmother, my mom's mom. And we saw it and decided, okay, I would come to Concordia in the end. Went there in 4 years. I left high school. If you look at my 1974 yearbook, it says he's going to double major in accounting and psychology. And I did major in psychology. Couldn't get into an accounting class, and instead took a history class. I never did take an accounting class. Hired quite a few accountants over the years in the various roles that I played, but instead earned my undergraduate degree in history at Concordia, and eventually would go on to earn my doctorate in American history from the University of Minnesota.
So, okay, so you leave the Virginia area, you go almost sight unseen to Moorhead, and having been to that town, that is really quite a transition. You certainly left this is more of a rural, northern European enclave, and so you decided to study history, and then, could you tell us a little bit more? You went to University of Michigan, that's where you got your PhD, is that right?
University of Minnesota, yes.
And then you decided to go into teaching, and tell me a little bit more about, what was your early teaching career like?
So I ended up finishing my PhD in 1984. Came out in the job market, which was a tough market, but I was fortunate. I had 3 job offers, and I ended up accepting one at the University of California, Berkeley. Now, the previous year, as I was finishing my doctorate, I taught 5 courses at the University of Minnesota. There was a faculty leave, a person on leave, and then another colleague who left the university under trying circumstances. So I ended up backfilling a lot of courses. So I had quite a bit of teaching experience, I dare say, by the time I arrived at Berkeley. Berkeley, I was actually not in history, but in African American studies. So it was an interdisciplinary program at the undergraduate level we had affiliation with a PhD program in ethnic studies, and so I had doctoral students in ethnic studies. And for me, it was fascinating because my students were, I was 29 years old, I think, not quite 30 when I started this role. And so some of my students were only a few years younger. But there was a way in which they allowed me to ask questions of them that today seems commonsensical, but I can recall in the Introduction to African Studies course, and I had a minor in African history, so they had me teaching African history as well as African American history. So I remember having all the students stand up, and it's before we had unraveled the human genome. But there was enough DNA analysis to show that humankind had originated on the African continent, and we can look at the markers and what happened. So I can remember having everyone stand up and says, you realize that based on what we know today, that you share 99.9% of the same DNA content. And so much of human history is about 1/10 of 1% of human difference. And so understand that as we began to try to tell the story of African history. So it was that way in which I was giving this talk in South Africa a little while ago, and folks said, that was really, I said, I know this would have been illegal in South Africa in 1985 when I said this. But there was a way in which I was encouraged to think broadly, to raise questions, and my students were willing to go along and challenge me on occasion as well. And I would have probably stayed at Berkeley. I came very close to staying at Berkeley for a lifetime, except for in 1988, 89, I received a call from Terry McDonald, the history department faculty here at the University of Michigan. And out of the blue, Terry calls me and says, Earl, we read a few of your articles. Would there be any chance you'd be interested in moving to the University of Michigan? And I'm sitting at Berkeley, and my Berkeley colleagues couldn't believe I would entertain the idea of leaving Berkeley. And I said, well, let me think about it. And I had a new child at that point. She was less than 2 years old, and I was thinking about the challenges of public schooling in the Bay Area. This is even in the mid to late 80s. And thought, you know, it may be easier to actually raise a child in Ann Arbor and to do it on a faculty member salary than in the Bay Area, where I thought I was going to have to certainly send her to private school, even though I was a product of public schools up until that time. And so in the end, I and my late ex-wife, Jane, we decided to move, and we did, and that was my first chapter as a faculty member at the University of Michigan, which lasted from 1989 to 2004.
All right. Well, when you came to the University of Michigan, I assume obviously having a degree, what was your area of specialization as it relates to history? What was your main interest? I mean, you gave up the accounting and the psychology interest, but you've kind of interdisciplinary areas, but what are your specific interest areas in history?
So I primarily teach American history, especially African American history. But I have written in labor history and in urban history, and broadly speaking in social history with, 8, 9 books of various kinds to my credit. After my first book, I realized I had the latitude and had the intellectual interest to cast about and to write on a series of topics. So the first book was in urban history. It's actually a story of African American migration from the rural South into the urban South, and principally into Norfolk, Virginia, and the community that was built between 1865 and 1945 in Norfolk. Fast forward, so that was 1991. It finished in 89, completed, published in 91. By 2000, I had completed a 10-volume series for young adults in African American history, which I co-edited with my colleague Robin Kelly, who's now at the at UCLA. By 2003, 2002, I co-authored a book with one of my former graduate students, Heidi Artizone, and that looked at this love trial that and case of a mixed marriage, the Rhinelander case, which became was noted, and it was the most visible case in this generation. With we would say at the time, it was like the O.J. Simpson case for another generation, where everyone was watching. All the tabloids and newspapers watched that, but that was a different story. That was a story about immigration and love and the law and the ways in which the public media capture the elements of a love story across racial lines.
Well, I'm hoping we will get an opportunity at the end of the show for folks they want to contact to learn more about some of your published works, not only your books, but some of your scholarly articles. I'm interested now that, so you've done quite a few years of teaching.
Yes.
But then you kind of moving into the more administrative aspects, as not only, we're going to get to Emory University here, and then also working with one of a very large nonprofit foundation called the Mellon Foundation. After you've been teaching here, and you've done this, the next role you go is to Emory. Is that correct?
I did.
An administrative role, or was it? I mean, you're an academic role, so you decided to leave the classroom. What was your motivation behind that?
So let me roll back to 1989. So when I moved to the University of Michigan from Berkeley, my colleagues at Berkeley, in an attempt to retain me, offered me a job as an assistant dean because it also came with additional resources. I said, no, I don't want any administrative role. Within a year of arriving, I was directing the Center for African American African Studies here at the University of Michigan. I would do that for 4 years. Okay. First on an interim basis, because I thought they were going to find someone much more qualified to do it than I was. And in the end, I discovered something that actually was pretty good at running organizations. And that it was a nice balance for me. So much about academic life is about deferred gratification. At least in history, you write a piece, you submit it, it goes through the review process. At the end of the stage, a year, 2 or 3, it comes out. By the time it shows up, literally I couldn't remember the words on the page until I reread them. With administrative life, I came to realize I could make a decision in the morning and it would have consequences by the afternoon. And for me, that turned out to be the right balance. And so I would go from leading what was then CAS, so that by 1997, I was interim dean and then dean of the Horace H. Rackham School of Graduate Studies at the University of Michigan. And so I would spend almost 7 years as dean of Rackham before leaving to become the provost and chief academic officer at Emory University, and which I did for almost another 9 years, 8.5.
So then you did move into the administrative. You liked the administrative role, and so you did that for several years. And then you ended up going I want to get us back here because that does dovetail to the reason we have you back is because of those experiences as an administrator. But you leave the academic world, and then you go to run the Mellon Foundation.
Yes.
Is that right? What was your motivation behind that?
So it was 2012, and I was a trustee of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in New York City. And we were looking for a new president. And so the board of trustees actually operated as a committee of the whole in selecting the president. We were searching around and about looking for and talking to potential candidates. I happened to take a delegation from Emory to Brazil for a week and missed a set of meetings. The Mellon Foundation, there was no way to call in from Brazil. So I fly back from Brazil on a Wednesday, change suitcases, and take a shower and sleep, and then hop on a plane the next morning, and I fly on a Thursday to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So it was that would have been March of 2013, and showed up as was typical. Went into a room for a committee meeting, and talked to one of my colleagues, and he and I would then proceeded to get up and walk into another room where we thought, okay, the whole committee was going to meet. They were all assembled there, and I thought, there are more people than I thought were going to be in this committee meeting. And I sat down, and I was promptly asked to leave the room. And I thought, okay, there's a penalty for actually going out of the country and missing a few meetings. I had no idea what this was about. And after caucusing, the chair of the board at that time, a woman, Ann Tatlock, and came along with Taylor Reevely, who was the vice chair and the president of William & Mary. They called me back into the room. And they turned to me and said, Earl, we've been looking all over, but we've come to realize that we may have the best candidate sitting among us, which you consider being the president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And this was a very pivotal moment because what they didn't know, because it wasn't public, I was in the final stages of a conversation about assuming the presidency of a major public research university.
Wow.
And in fact, I was due, this was a Thursday, I was due to have the final set of conversations with the board on that coming Monday. And so I'm sitting in New York, so happens my wife, Susan Whitlock, my wife, I got remarried. Susan and I both were in New York at the same time. So I get up out of the meeting. I said, well, sit down. She says, why? I just sit down. Our life may have been thrown a curve. We thought we were heading in to one place, but I have another option that's presented itself. And so the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation was unique because it's one of the few private foundations that really supports higher education. 70% of our dollars go, when I was president and before, to support higher education. But we also are major supporters of the arts, the leading supporter of the not-for-profit arts world, of museums, theater, et cetera, probably in the United States, certainly on a per capita basis.
Well, and I think we could discuss just all the fascinating things that the Mellon Foundation does, folks, because it really is amazing. Mellon scholarships, there's all sorts of stuff that they're involved with. But then I guess that it kind of going with what you were saying, you then come up with maybe something that was planned or maybe something that wasn't. You are approached, I assume, by the University of Michigan yet again to return once again to Ann Arbor. I guess Mellon's in New York City?
Mellon's in New York City.
Okay, so you're maybe someone is motivating you to come back to Ann Arbor. And what is it about the brand new Center for Social Solutions that was going to take you away from Mellon to bring you and your family back to Ann Arbor?
So this is actually I have had a understanding all my life, and I used to always tell my graduate students, plan your life in 10-year increments, but reevaluate where you are every 5 years. So I was at a 5-year moment of reflection, and I thought, I'm the president of it was $5.8 billion when I started, it was $6.8 billion. By the time I left private foundation, we gave away $300 to $350 million a year to support activities. During my 5 years, we actually gave away $1.2 billion. And I thought one could continue this life forever, or one could actually step out and take a chance. And so I actually approached the University of Michigan and talked to a few other places because I decided that if I have 10 years of a working life left, how do I think I can make the greatest difference? And so I thought of this idea of the Center for Social Solutions. And Michigan was among a handful of institutions that I had on the list, and I thought it had the constituent elements of faculty broadly educated and trained, curious in ways, students, expertise across 4 or 5 fields. And in the end, when I talked to Mark Schlissel and to Paul Caranda originally, and then Martin Filbert, it became clear that coming back to the University of Michigan made a whole lot of sense.
Well, we're kind of glad that this fit into your 5-year plan,
Yeah.
It seems, at this point. Then I guess that, this is for those not aware, I mean, starting at a center requires money, it becomes knowledge and everything. I guess my first question to you about the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan would be, what is the mission statement of this school within the university? What is it that you want this organization to be able to achieve?
So the center is designed to work on 3 to 4 select problems for the next decade, to bring together interdisciplinary teams to think about not just core and basic research, but the policy implications. And how do we begin to actually make some headway in addressing questions in and around diversity and race in one category, water in a second category, and then the third category is the dignity of labor in an automated world. And so on the diversity front, while still president of the Mellon Foundation, I, in partnership with Nancy Cantor, who had been provost here at Michigan and is now the chancellor of the University of Rutgers at Newark, has started a book series and initiative called Our Compelling Interest, The Value of Diversity for a Prosperous Democracy. And we're 3 books in. This was the first book, which was sort of a way to begin to really set the stage for asking, how do we define diversity? How do we begin to value diversity? But then, even more important, how do we begin to leverage it for the benefit of all? And so with that book, we've now went from that to Scott Page, who is my colleague again at the University of Michigan, where Scott has a book that really looks at complex organizations and where he argues that in hundreds, if not thousands of studies, when you're dealing with a complex problem, the more diverse the team, the better solutions over and over and over and over again. And Scott is able to articulate and demonstrate. And then we decided the third book is just out of Many Faiths, that deals with religion, but actually begins to tell the story of Islam from the early days of the Republic through the present, and the ways in which America has always had a pluralistic approach to religious expression and understanding. As we began to struggle over Islamophobia and a whole range of other concerns about the Muslim faith, it's important to step back and understand the whole question of religious pluralism. And so those are the first three books. We have others in the queue. And that's just one part of our compelling interest part of the overall center and its work. We're also about to start a project that looks at the history and legacy of slavery on the American psyche and the American people. As we approach 2019, here you can tell I'm a historian. It's the 400th anniversary of the importation of the first African peoples into colonial Jamestown. It seems now to be reminded that for 60% of the history of what became the United States, slavery was the dominant political economy. It organized and framed and shaped all of our understanding. And has echoes even today, not only in the symbols and the battles over Confederate statues and the Confederate flag, but the ways in which people talk to one another. And when they find themselves sometimes struggling, they remind one or the other that one came from a lineage of folks who were enslaved and others who were not. But what we also realize is that the story of slavery is not just a black and white story. 2.5 to 5 million Native Americans were also enslaved, which is not often talked about in the new book by Andres Resendez. He talks about the other slavery. And so what we want to do here, working with public media, working with academics and museums and public theaters and a whole range of others, is to begin to create a coordinated set of conversations about not only the history of slavery, but its aftermath. And we've engaged about 20, 30 people around the country so far who are going to try to work with us to pull this off. Now, water, coming back to Michigan and given what's happened in Flint, and people keep saying, are you dealing with the Flint issue? And we go, no, there are hundreds, if not thousands of folks who rightly are dealing with that issue. We're asking a different question. It's simple and complex at the same time. The simple version is there a way to come up with a regional demonstration project that can be scaled nationally and exported globally for moving water from flood-prone areas to drought-stricken areas? I've been all the way up to the Arctic, to Barrow, Alaska, and BP plants, and seen how we can move oil thousands of miles across all kind of terrain and all. I've talked to people with the gas lines and pipes along the eastern seaboard as we move natural gas, and talked to a lot of engineers asking, why can't we move water? And the engineers always come back with the same answer. It's not an engineering problem. We can design systems to move vast quantities of water effectively and efficiently. But it is a regulatory problem. It's a fiscal problem. It's a political problem. It's a political will problem. And so the center wants to see if we can find the partners to see if we can come up with a regional demonstration project that can be scalable, because this is also a global problem. I was in Cape Town in January and saw the effects of water maintenance and challenges for a global city like Cape Town. I was talking to folks from Morocco and other parts of the world, all seeing the effects of climate change in one form or another, and where sometimes it seems like it's too much water and other times not enough water at all. How do we begin to think through, if we create one set of problems on one side, can we actually create solutions on the other? And then the dignity of labor, just real quickly, the dignity of labor is a critical piece.
Sure.
Because as we think about future work, and there's this recent study came out a year ago by McKinsey and consultants where they predict that by 2030, 800 million jobs worldwide that exist at this moment will have disappeared. 54 million in the United States, 1/3 of the American workforce. New jobs will come certainly in this place, but not everyone will benefit. And here's a question as I talk to technologists and friends of mine at MIT and Carnegie Mellon, let alone here at the University of Michigan, as we design these new systems. And you have the economists among my friends who talk about the introduction of a universal basic income or basic wage. Interestingly enough, I think Martin King actually talked about that in the late 1960s. And so sometimes 50 years it takes for something to sit there before it becomes more fashionable. But a UBI in and of itself may not solve all of the questions around what does it mean to have work? How do you want to find oneself in a global and communal setting if you can't answer the question, what do I do? And how do we begin now to work with all of those who are creating these new systems to begin to ask the question. We create new opportunities, but how do we think about and deal with the dignity of labor?
Well, you've got your hands full with that. Those three very interesting subjects, but it also does lead to planning for the future, thinking about just global resources and some of the other things. You have everything from being an educator to being an administrator to running a major foundation, being a provost, running a major institution at Emory. And I'm interested in this question of how in today, when you look at preparing students for this world to come, that you're actually hopefully being somewhat integrated and seeing it come and bringing it to fruition, asking the right questions. What is going to happen to how do we rework the liberal arts to prepare not only students for this world that's coming, and where from all of your academic and dealing with faculty and students and staff and your vast career, Dr. Lewis, what's going to happen to the liberal arts in the coming 10 years?
So I actually think the liberal arts will see a renaissance in the next 10 years. So one of my last gestures, if not acts, before I left the Mellon Foundation was to create something called the Mellon Research Forum to support researchers and scholars in a variety of areas to really puzzle over and about critical questions. The first one they're taking on is the future of the liberal arts and the value of the liberal arts. And so Mike McPherson, the former president of Macalester College and former president of the Spencer Foundation, is co-leading this effort to bring together teams of scholars working independently and collectively to work on this. But the reason I actually think it's important, there's a new book by Joseph Aoun, the president of Northeastern. And Northeastern has a strong technical component to its curriculum. But Joe argues in this book, it's called Robot Proof. And in a way, he argues that it is traditions of the liberal arts that will make future generations of students robot proof, more so than technical expertise in STEM. And STEM alone. It's not to say that students shouldn't understand coding and shouldn't understand something about the ways in which STEM-related technical questions get formulated, but they also need to understand how to ask the question. What background questions need to be understood? I mean, how do we understand something like art and beauty as we begin think back to Apple? I mean, the whole thing about Stephen Jobs and how he was interested in some calligraphy because he was looking at style and beauty and not just the machine in and of itself. As we fashion a world going forward, my sense is that students who actually have background in liberal arts, who've been exposed to more than one way of thinking, who know where to go to look for answers to questions, would find that they actually can cycle through the ups and downs of the economy. But more than that, they actually can help create new sets of possibilities. And I'll conclude with E.O. Wilson, the biologist, wrote in a book a couple of years ago. He says, for all of our fascination with STEM, if aliens came from another world, they wouldn't ask to be taken to see our STEM. Science, technology, engineering, and math. The fact that they were here would suggest that their systems were far superior to ours. But they may ask to go and see what we think of as beauty and how we define beauty, understand our cosmology and why we actually practice certain religious traditions. Want to know something about the languages we created and the ways we communicated. May want to know in ways what we thought of as we were writing stories and imagine a world that couldn't be seen but yet could be imagined. And so Wilson, in this interesting and sort of indirect way, is saying it is that ability to actually harness the resources that we think of as the traditional liberal arts that may be our salvation in the end.
Well, and that is encouraging, having a degree from a liberal arts university, but I do also want to mention that one of your colleagues at the Ross School of Business was talking about the problems that we face, and you're going to be in the middle of this, of globalization. And I can be honest, having been around the world, the Asian cultures and some of the others, they are not as interested in the liberal arts. They don't have the history of this. They're more used to scientific methodology. And even in our own country right now, we're running into, there are certain departments and various institutions that are shutting down, whether it be history and political science at University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. And again, this is the beauty of that. The question, because of the increased cost of education, as well as the need that, in fact, Professor Branch was mentioning, that you don't want someone who doesn't have that well-rounded view, and not only in terms of being able to think, but we're also dealing, in addition to that, the ability of people through another thing that you're studying, of course, which is the digitalization of education. And so, again, having seen all this, how are you going to be able to integrate not only a greater understanding of the liberal arts with the changing technology of education and the delivery of it at the same time? Just an easy one.
Yeah. So I actually think part of the answer here is that student curiosity will lead some into areas that we had not imagined. And part of what we need to do is figure out how to create a curriculum that allows for the student who doesn't want to major in information systems management yet to have exposure to it, because it would prove as valuable to them as learning a foreign language. But I probably would disagree in terms of Asian cultures. And so I'll give two quick examples. I've spent a bit of time in China and have been to India. And so in India, I was once having a conversation with a group of Emory alums, and a young man was there who was an Emory alum, and I turned to him, I said, "So what did you major in?" He says, "Well, I got my undergrad degree in business. I have a BBA from Emory University." I said, "Okay, what was your most important course?" And he says, "Turns out, actually, my art history courses turned out to be the most important courses I took. It was not my finance courses or my accounting courses." I said, "Tell me that." I had not met him, but in front of this group, I said, "Tell me about it." He says, "Look, I inherited a family business. I spent a lot of time cultivating clients across Europe. And in ways," he says, "my art history allows me to actually have a conversation that's sort of level setting with my would-be customers before I get into the execution of the contract. We can talk about the great masters and what they look like and who they're about. I can converse with them and we can compare Indian styles to European styles." He says, "It's that ability." He says, "I didn't understand that when I was 18 and 19 or 20 years old." He says, "If I were to go back now, I would double major in art history." And all. And I'm sitting there going, I told him, I said, "I'm going to tell this story for the next 40 years. And so I'll leave your name out, but just understand that part," because he had a revelation that only comes through experience and being out there. And I've heard this over and over again. If people only had the chance to go back, they would have actually taken more courses in different ways. Same thing in China.
Sure.
And so in dealing with Chinese universities, when I was still here at Michigan, and certainly when I was at Emory as well, our Chinese colleagues will often say, "So what's your special sauce?" I mean, the way it was phrased. And which I interpreted to be, how do you actually teach curiosity and creativity? We can teach students to learn to master the test. But mastering the test is not designing the next set of, and you name it, because then you have to actually be able to see something that doesn't exist, and sort of go from concept to execution, and we need to figure out how to actually do that very thing, and so we ended up having endless sets of conversations about the very liberal arts, and my guess is that come the next 10, 15 years, there'll probably be even more capital investment in the liberal arts across China.
Well, now that is encouraging.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm going to leave you with one final question, because when we've talked about this, you kind of have segmented your life into these different pockets of time. And I don't want to we don't want to think about your life beyond Ann Arbor at this point, but if it be 5 years from now or 10, and you may find some other rebirth and some other process. But I guess the question, I think, particularly for those of us here in town thinking about coming back and all the wonderful things, being in Ann Arbor, you get to see all the magnificent education. What do you hope to accomplish by starting this, that you could look back and say, with everything because it's you're used to, you like being an administrator and starting new projects and very entrepreneurial in that sense. What is your goal? What do you want to say in 5 years if you came back on A2 Insight and said, "This is what I want to achieve, and this is what we have achieved at the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan?
So in 5 years, if I came back, I'd like to be able to say that the center did 3 things. One, it connected people in institutions who weren't connected. And I mean, as I mentioned, MIT and Carnegie Mellon. So the presidents of both places are friends of mine. One used to be my neighbor here in Ann Arbor, Farnham Johanian, the new president of Carnegie Mellon. But they actually don't know what the other one is doing. Raphael Reif is the president of MIT. And so there's a way in which we actually perhaps, because we have relationships across a whole set of institutions, we can be matchmaker when matchmaker is necessary, interlocutor when interlocutor is important, and if nothing else, the keeper of the transition of information as we move it from one place to another. So that's one thing. 2, I actually like to be able to educate a whole generation of students, undergrad and graduate students, to believe that problems can be solved. It is not that we just study problems, but that actually you can work in a tangible way and approach some kind of solution to problems. You can't do it alone. You have to do it and with others because these problems are complex. It goes back to Scott's book in a way, the diversity bonus, that you actually need for these complex problems, complex and diverse teams working on them. But I like students to actually believe that they can be the architects of the future they desire. And if we can do that, that will be successful. And I think the third part is that at the end of 5 years, I'll come back and say, I had fun doing it. I had a lot of fun doing it. We learned a lot. We made mistakes. We learned from those mistakes. But in our own way, we hopefully have helped to improve the world.
Dr. Earl Lewis is the founding director of the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan. I want to thank you very much for being on our program.
Thank you.
For today. And again, for A2 Insight, until next time, I'm James Trost.